right, let's open up the floor to questions. And again, if you need to make a grand statement, you're happy to make it. Keep it a minute or two, and it would be nice if you could end your grand statement potentially with a question, but that's not an absolute requirement. Before I forget also, I want to thank Rob Prince, who has been very much both a colleague and he might not know this, but very much, I think, a mentor to me in our and a wonderful friend and colleague in discussing. We often have to close the door for our discussions unless we both put our careers in jeopardy sometimes, I think, here at this institution. I won't say more than that, but I'm willing to sell transcripts, by the way, of those conversations. All right here.
Nicole, you briefly touched on the sort of decentralization of the movement across the country, and I wonder if the three of you who are involved in the movement could discuss the issue of decentralization versus, organization, and how that relates to, stopping acts of violence, and what that contributes or doesn't contribute to the perceived legitimacy of the movement as a whole.
So I know that, and I don't, let me get known, I haven't occupied in terms of camping out. I've been to General Assemblies, and I try to get to as many marches as possible. So I have been involved, but I don't camp out. It is difficult, all the jokes that are made about twinkle fingers, right? This is consensus and it's disapproval. Everything's made in terms of general consensus and really asking people what they think and getting contributions that way. It could be in that setup, it could be a risk of violence taking over. Fortunately, this movement is largely nonviolent. So yeah, people do talk about these things. These questions get raised. Not last Saturday, but the Saturday before, with the problems that we faced with the Denver Police Department. That violence, as it started to come up, was largely stopped by fellow protesters. It's not always easy, but that's the movement that's the general sentiment that pervades the whole movement. That we're not violent, that we do want peace, and part of this movement is caring about one another, right? So we're not going to let that get out of hand. We can talk a little bit about whether or not the consensus-based movement, it can be a weakness or a strength. I think a lot of times it's a strength. After 2 Saturdays ago, that violent incident, committees were put together. A nonviolent committee was formed to disseminate information based on what to do to de-escalate a situation should it arise. It basically addressed the fact that police officers faced with a large crowd will be intimidated, and that they're human beings as well. And what we need to do is stay calm, understand how they might feel in that situation, and not escalate it. So that, I actually have one in my pocket. I can pass around later. It's a card that we printed up and handed out to everyone at last Saturday's march to say, here's what happens if things get violent. So that consensus, yes, it can be a double-edged sword in terms of leadership, but yeah, I think that for the most part, this has prevailed in a very positive way.
Also, the decentralization is being overcome by the alternate media and the social media sources that I was talking about. All activity is on the internet, and we share it across the internet daily, and that is actually part of, I guess, like a job. If you support Occupy Wall Street, it's kind of like a duty to continue to share Facebook or Tumblr or Flickr or whatever you have that you think is relevant. So if there's a violence issue in Denver, it floats all over, and other Occupy sites learn from that as well, and they use that in their committees to plan and keep an eye out for that stuff. And it's very interesting when you're in a nonviolent movement. There's a tension there, and that's the part that you have to be there to understand. Even though you're standing there peacefully with all these people, there's a real tension that exists, especially when you have riot police staring at you. So, and you're not doing anything but being a peaceful citizen. It's very, very interesting.
Sasha, did you say?
No, thank you.
One of the things I want to say is also is that, if I might, is that consensus decision making is very, very difficult. If you haven't been ever involved in it, you really have tried that as an experience in your life at some point. I mean, I can't tell you how difficult it is. And even with that, you're going to have people who are not going to be part and parcel of wanting to do that. And so that nonviolence training is a critical element of these kinds of movements. I'd also just like to suggest to my younger colleagues here and others is that I remember when I was finishing my graduate work and starting to teach at Harvard that the anti-apartheid movement was kicking in and shareholder responsibility. But Harvard, as an institution, has been around for a while, right? And it had learned from its mistakes from the Vietnam era, the Vietnam protests, and the civil rights protests. And they weren't going to make the same mistakes twice dealing with a new generation. So there's a new generation of people at that point, and what they did, which I thought was wonderful, was they turned to, I was considered an old timer then. I can't imagine what you think of me now, but to turn to as old timers, those of us who had been in the anti-Vietnam movement, and said, how come, this institution is so effective at blocking everything that we're trying to do? And I said, well, it's because they learned from us not to make the same mistakes. So they teamed up with the older generation of anti-war protesters and civil rights protesters, and then we put our heads together through multiple generations, if you want to put together, saying, okay, that's an institution that's been around. They've learned from their mistakes. Let's get more creative. So I would encourage that process to continue, as those of us who are sitting a little bit in the bleachers, if we're not going to be downstate spending the night or marching, at least make ourselves available to act as a resource. Let's go, Michael. Then. Okay.
I find myself when I watch Occupy, and I have actually not been able to make it down because of crazy transit issues. I haven't found people willing to chauffeur me down, but on the weekdays, which is when I tend to do it. But I tend to be thinking to myself, as an ideal legislator, what do I do? As someone who is more than a little sympathetic to what Occupy is doing and to the eye-opening understanding of what this inequality means, what is my concrete goal? Is it enough that I work to repeal Citizens United? Is it enough that I try to institute a Tobin tax on international currency transactions? Is it enough that I work for public financing of campaigns? I get the sense that the answer is no, and that there's something far broader in all of this that everything is feeding into. But as someone who is actually trying to see this situation move forward, what do we do? How do we distill what we know we want into proposal, concrete thoughts of change?
Those are, I think, very important questions, and I wouldn't say we should, that's futile. I think all of those things to address them. But I've thought about this a long time too. I thought about just how effective. What is the big? What's the effective thing we can do? And one of the things as I'm referring to my comments and my own realization is that not as a criticism against the occupiers, and that it's really us in the bleachers,
right? And
that we're not challenging the power structures. The very structure of power, I should say, in this country, the way it is that it makes everything else that you're referring to, noble and important as it is, it does make it almost as if it's never going to change anything. We talk about campaign finance reform, and I was a big supporter of that when I saw it, but right away the loopholes are there. They always put the loopholes in, and those loopholes then become the tunnel, if you will, that just incarcerates our democracy. And so, you know, to challenge the structure of power is to, I think, we have to make this democracy and a representative democracy. It has to work. And the only way it's going to work is, again, money needs to be taken out of politics, and votes have to become the currency of our political system, so that ideas, and those of us who believe in free markets, the free marketplace of idea is sacred. And that should be the place where all of this can take place, so that we have a chance. I'm not saying we're going to always be able to get our ways, but you know, when interest groups and people can form, like you think around this country, there's hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people that are identifying with the Occupy activists, that would be a profound movement put into action that would make the plutocrats and make the titans tremble. Everything else, I just feel like if we don't change the structures of power in this country, we're just going to be revisiting these issues down the road. We'll never address the big ones, and we'll always be coming back to kind of a Gilded Age again. Hard-fought battles will be fought over and over and over again.
Just a quick thing in terms of making the plutocracy tremble. I'm a non-violent practitioner, and I really abhor the violence that surrounded this event in Oakland. But I personally I don't want to really bugged in here or anything. I was personally incredibly excited at the strike that shut down the port in Oakland. It's my opinion that folks in power are going to listen when we hit their bottom lines and when they start to hurt as a consequence of not listening. And along these lines, I've been very encouraged by the labor movement in various pieces, the Teamsters, the teachers, the nurses, whoever it is joining on, because I think that there's a real potential to implement like classic labor, not labor militancy, but classic labor action and labor activist action in the context of Occupy Wall Street. So shutting down ports, shutting down main roads, making it hard to do business as usual. And of course, always in a non-violent fashion. But I think civil disobedience is going to be really key. And I think it needs to be strategic. I think it needs to be put in places where we're actually going to be losing people money, right? The longer they don't listen to us. I mean, I think that that's one of the best ways to hit them where it hurts as well.